Hello and welcome to Through the Mist with me, your host. This is a Royal University podcast where we look at the law and try to understand how it all works. In this episode, we'll be looking at the House of Life. The House of Life, it's a house that gives you life. Yeah. Hi, Mistbusters. Welcome back to episode number 65. Yay! What to say? Well, first of all, if you're listening to this live as it comes out, sorry, this one's a bit late. Last month was busier than I expected, and I have poor planning. Yeah, sorry about that. And it's really hot right now. I'm like sweating already, and I've just started recording. It is sweat central. But like, oh, seriously, when like the heroes of the Royal Universe are going to get together and defeat capitalism so that we can start not having climate change? Thank you. That would be great. Please. Do you know what? We're just going to get straight into it. There's not much to say. The House of Life. The House of Life. What are we going to look at with regards to the House of Life? We're going to look at the history of the House of Life, how the House of Life came to be what it is in the Royal Universe today. And where better place to start than the actual ancient history that we have? Well, the House of Life was a place aligned with kingship and used to record and create knowledge. Okay, that makes sense. What we picture and what we see in the Royal Universe, that makes sense. The earliest references to the House of Life come from royal decrees from the Old Kingdom around 2200 BC, mentioning the requirements of the House of Life, but not what those requirements are, and not what the function of the House of Life is, no scope. So we just know it existed. So this is like being this place, this institution has been part of Egyptian culture for a long time. There are two artifacts, stelae, from the late Middle Kingdom that give us our first insight into the titles held within the House of Life. These are the Scribe of the House of Life and the Chief Physician. Again, the Scribe of the House of Life, it's all about recording data and recording information, so that's the job of the scribe in this scenario, I guess. And then the chief physician is, I don't know, magic, like healing, and that sort of knowledge is probably within the House of Life remit as well. So then as you move into the late period, it is believed that there may have been a House of Life attached to all main temples throughout Egypt. So what a House of Life actually is, well, it seems to be, so it's connected directly to temples and palaces, but it seems to be this storage place. It is, the house is, in this sense, the building, the room. It is the place of knowledge within the temples and stuff. In the late period and the Ptolemaic period, the House of Life seems to become more linked with Osiris and rituals including them. But again, this is all felt because they were the ones leading these rituals, because they were the ones that had the papyruses, the information, the records to tell them what these rituals and how to undertake these rituals. So there is a manuscript that gives details on the construction of the House of Life at Abolis. That's definitely said wrong, which is believed to also apply to other House of Lives attached to temples during the late period. So as I said, we've got like the building plans or like a description of the building attached to this one temple. So again, these were like the places where they would store the knowledge to undertake things at the temple, I guess. These in turn may have also been used, these manuscripts and plans and details may have been used at the House of Life at the main palace in the center of Egyptian kingship. Again, it feeds into this idea of that they're all kind of linked. But was the House of Life a school? Well, it's not 100% clear. Obviously, being to do with recording and keeping knowledge, it does seem to have some sort of academic nature about it. But more than likely it was a place where they trained their own apprentices internally. So it didn't function as a traditional school. It functioned as a repository of knowledge, and the documents that were being consulted and composed in such places, but they didn't necessarily share these knowledge out freely. It wasn't a freely given set of knowledge. It was, you had this knowledge, you had this title, you were able to work. So the House of Life was... There were other such institutions that were similar to the House of Life seem to be storing knowledge. The House of Books and the Hall of Written Documentation are others referenced in stuff that I found online. But there doesn't seem to be that much about the House of Life online in general. It seems to be quite a light topic. So what I've gathered from the history of it all is that House of Life in history, in real Egypt, was almost a library for the temporalic, that's not, the rituals of the gods and of what would have been considered magic or at the times, but this may have also included medicine, other things that you would go to a temple to get healed or please appease the gods and stuff. The amount of time this took me to research, I'm blasting through this quick. I'm going to blame the heat. So what is the House of Life in the books? So the House of Life in the books is a magical institution. It is headed by the chief lector, broken into gnomes, and it teaches the magics of the world to people that come inside it. So a bit like the the real House of Life, it's not a free school, it is a private school. We've talked about the gnomes before, specifically number them, but just context reasons, they exist and can be seen as described as books. It's almost an extension of the existing system, I guess. If these things were once attached to temples, the main temple of an area, and say the area, I don't know, is called a gnome, which it is, then maybe the main temple had its own House of Life, so you had one House of Life per gnome, and then when they were expanding over the world and were like, okay, we need to put these in place, they just used their traditional terminology for these things, and the 360 gnomes became a thing. The purpose in this context is in helping ensure that the world is appropriately watched over by magicians. So, yeah, and again, as I said, it's an extension of basically them being attached to a temple. As we talked about previously, gnomes are almost attached to Egyptian artifacts these days. There are places like the 360th gnome, which is kind of there just to make sure all places are covered versus actually being a gnome. However, there was something I just mentioned there that I didn't mention at all in the history section. Lector priests. The chief lector. Not mentioned at all in my research about the House of Life. So I looked it up. What is a lector? So lector priests, they really have even less information than the House of Life on them. On the internet. Like there's a couple books that it links you to and then Wikipedia. So it's really kind of hard to find anything on them. But what I did find is that the term lector priest is used to describe an Egyptian term. I'm not attempting to pronounce it here. I haven't even got it written in my notes. So I can't even attempt to pronounce it. But it translates to something along the lines of the carrier of the book of rituals. And then this morphed in late Egyptian language to refer to magician, which when I read that, I found that quite fun, that the chief lector in the books is the most powerful magician. And lectern in this context basically just means magician, which is kind of fun to think about. But yeah, the they were to carry the book of rituals. So they basically were the ones who recited the spells and the hymns during temples and other rituals and official ceremonies. The highest ranking of the lectern priest was the chief lectern. However, this was most likely temple specific, so each temple would have its own chief lectern, rather than a chief lectern encompassing the whole thing. We go, okay, we're following. And since the House of Life was connected to temples, I don't think it's such a stretch to say that the priests would have learnt their craft and used the knowledge within the House of Life to undertaking these things. And it is almost that the House of Life wasn't its own separate body. It was connected. It was a connected part of temple infrastructure. That the lectors became the magicians, but the chief lector kept its name as the chief lector, and they were just the most powerful magician. As times went on, and the Egyptian society went underground, basically, and these magicians went underground and hiding, and they hid all the things. The magic that they kept all these terms like gnomes, like chief lector, but it kind of morphed, and they were still the keepers of the knowledge. So they were still the House of Life rather than any specific temple. They were this institution that was around all magics rather than a specific one. And then meaning that the chief lectern, they were still lecterns, they were still lector priests, but they were just magicians. So by the time you get into modern times, having the chief lectern be that such person makes perfect sense. It follows through with the rest of the procedure. So yeah, that is the House of Life. Like I said, this is a ridiculously short episode. I didn't think it would be this short. My notes gave me the impression that it would at least be 20 minutes, but I rattled through those in like no time at all. Plus all the edits I'm going to take out. This is a short episode. So, but that is the House of Life. I think it's not quite as extensive as maybe I thought it would be. The House of Life in ancient times seems to be this kind of nebulous thing that then it makes sense how it would morph from this nebulous thing into how we see it in the Voidiverse. I think the flow between the two can be seen quite clearly and makes quite a lot of sense. So there's not much for me to try and nitpick or make force to work together. It just kind of naturally works, which is really helpful. Anyway, thank you for indulging this theory. If you have any comments on this theory or theories of your own that you want me to discuss, you can email them through who.t.mist@gmail.com, or you can follow the Instagrams and threads @who_mist. Make sure to like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, whatever you have to do to help get the podcast out there. I've been Owen, and come back next time as we try to see through the mist. Bro, it is so hot though.